Welcome to Trasnatira. We're a collective group of independent historians who aren't going to let a virus get in the way of us remembering our Irish history. We are welcoming back Jim McVeigh tonight, who gave an excellent talk last week on Lieutenant General Joe McKelvey. Tonight we're going to be looking at the execution of Tom Williams. Before we get started, just to let you know about upcoming talks. On Tuesday at 8 p.m, we've Irish Republican Memorials by Shea Olansig. On Wednesday, we have the Irish Tower House by Finola Finlay. On Friday, we have Conserving Carvings in Irish Rock Art by Claire O'Sullivan. Tom Williams, who we're talking about tonight, was a volunteer in C Company 2nd Battalion of the Belfast Brigade in the Irish Republican Army from the Bombay Street area of Belfast, Northern Ireland, and he was hanged in the Crumlin Road Gaol for his involvement in the killing of RUC police officer named Patrick Murphy during the Northern Campaign. Our speaker tonight, Jim McVeigh, trade union organiser with SIPTU. He's a former city councillor, Sinn Féin group leader on Belfast City Council. He's also a former Republican prisoner who spent over 16 years in jail and was released under the terms of the Good Friday Agreement. He's a keen interest in history. He's written 2 books, first on the execution of Tom Williams and the second on Joe McKelvey. He's a founder member of the James Connolly Visitor Centre on the Falls Road, and he's trimmed his beard since last week as well. Jim, you're very welcome back.
Not a problem, Marcus, thank you.
Away you go.
Okay, Tom Williams. Most people would be aware, of course, that Tom was hung in September, 2nd September 1972. So, but let's dig a little bit deeper into Tom's personal history and the context and the environment in which he became the young man that he did become eventually. He was born in a street called Montgomery Street, just off the Falls Road, on May 12th, 1923, just after partition. And some of maybe your Belfast listeners would be familiar with that name. Montgomery Street is spelled Amzomri, right? It's an unusual name, but it actually stands. It's an abbreviation actually for the American Committee for Relief in Ireland, and that street and a number of other houses around that particular district. It's a working class area of West Belfast. Was built with money that had been raised in America to build homes to house the thousands of Catholics who had been driven from their homes during the pogrom of that period from 1920 through to 1923. And Tom's family had been driven out of the Shore Road area of Belfast, and like many other Catholic families, were driven into what really became Catholic ghettos in many respects. But I used to pass that street going to school as a young lad, and that would have had friends who lived in Montgomery Street, didn't know what it was and what it meant. But that's what it actually stands for. Over £100,000 was raised in the US and sent to Belfast to assist with rehoming the people who had lost their homes as a consequence of the pogroms. And ironically, Tom's family, who had been driven out of one part of Belfast, were found a home in a new part of Belfast that had been built from money that had been sent from the States. And just to mention that, I think Daniel Jack had been on recently and had spoke about that period, about the nature of the pogroms at the time. Just to mention this by way of context, because it's almost impossible to imagine how horrible the pogroms were, how devastating they were to particularly the Catholic community in Belfast at that time. And just to give you a few stats, between 1920 and 1923, 557 people were killed in Belfast. Most of them, the majority of them, were Catholics. And even though at the time the Catholic population was only a quarter of the whole population in Belfast, but yet the vast majority of who lost their lives were Catholics. Between 8,000 and 11,000 people were driven from their jobs. Catholics were driven from their jobs. Although there was a number of those were labour and trade union activists, many of them Protestants, who stood up for their co-workers and their colleagues, and were driven out of their jobs as well, and along with those people. 23,000 Catholics driven from their homes. Like, just think about that. 23,000 in Belfast, and over 500 Catholic businesses destroyed. So it's hard to imagine today, but the pogroms that swept across Belfast before, during, and after partition were unprecedented, you know, and changed the whole geography and demography of Belfast. And that's why Belfast became, if you like, in the decades that followed, so segregated. You could look at an aerial view of the city, and you could say, that's where the Catholics live, and that's where the Protestants live. It was essentially because of that huge population movement at the time. So that was the context of that Tom grew up. Sectarianism, it wasn't a myth. It was very much a part of their lives. And he was born on Montgomery Street. His father, like a lot of nationalists and Republicans, moved south and joined the Free State Army, and left Tom and his brother in the care of his mother, Tom's grandmother, his Granny Faye, as she became famously known, and she lived on Bombay Street. So while he was born on Montgomery Street, he grew up on Bombay Street. And of course, Bombay Street, if you tuned into Sean Murray's talk the other night, you will know the history of Bombay Street, the significance of Bombay Street. Bombay Street has you know, a long history of coming under sectarian attack at heightened periods of tension down through the decades. So his father left. He moved in with his granny, and he was reared in the shadow of Clonard Monastery and in Bombay Street. And he joined the Fianna. There's a connecting theme with a lot of these IRA leaders, isn't there? When you look at them from those periods, he joined the Fianna and progressed into the IRA, probably 1940, 1941, after the Second World War had started. And as you said, Marcus, he was a member of C Company of the Belfast Battalion of the IRA, and he eventually became the officer commanding of C Company, even though he was quite a very young man at that time. And the background, as people will know, ironically, is we're talking about Sean Russell the other night in the context. Of course, Sean Russell had taken control of the IRA following an IRA convention in 1938. He was appointed the Chief of Staff of the IRA. And under his leadership, the IRA launched a new military campaign. Of course, the difference this time was that unlike the previous campaigns, this campaign would largely be fought on England's soil, in England's territory, rather than here in the 6 counties or along the border. Although when the campaign began, it began tragically at the end of 1938, when 3 IRA volunteers were killed in a premature explosion near Castlefin in County Donegal as they were preparing to attack a number of border posts along the border at the time. But really, the campaign began in 1939 with 2 bombs detonated in London, 3 in Manchester, 1 in Birmingham, and 1 in Alnwick, wherever that is. I think I'm not too sure where that is. So the campaign this time, and the campaign was a very different type of campaign. It was a sophisticated campaign, but it wasn't being fought in the north. And Russell and the small number of key people around him were determined to wage a campaign, a bombing campaign, essentially, in England. And so there wasn't really very much for the ordinary IRA volunteer to do during that period, other than gather intelligence, train, prepare, And of course, there was a lobby. There would have been a significant lobby within the IRA pushing the leadership at that time to begin a campaign in the north as well as the one in England. But the leadership at that period were largely southern-based men, and Russell and the key people around him, Seamus O'Donovan and co., were focused on the campaign that was being fought in England. But as I say, the IRA had begun the campaign in 1839. Actually, about probably maybe about 7 months, 8 months before the Second World War actually began. It wasn't a case that the Second World War had already begun. The IRA leadership decided to launch a campaign that actually began their campaign before the outbreak of the Second World War. And of course, the context was, so whenever Tom had joined the IRA, the Second World War had begun. And whatever about this idea that England's difficulty would be Ireland's opportunity, the outbreak of the Second World War and the intervention of America, I think towards the end of 1941 with the attack on Pearl Harbor, created the worst possible political circumstances for the IRA, given its dependency upon Irish American support, etc. So the climate for the conflict changed drastically for the worse in many respects. But of course, Tom was only 19 years of age, and was probably oblivious to some of the big geopolitical considerations that others may have been aware of. So 1942, middle of the Second World War, hundreds of thousands of men being killed all over the continent of Europe. And the old guard of the IRA, Sean Russell, had died, as you know, on a German U-boat on his way to returning to Ireland. And a lot of the original leadership who launched the campaign were replaced by Belfast men or Northerners, people like Sean McVeigh and others. And they decided to switch the focus of the campaign to the 6 counties. Effectively, the campaign in England had run out of steam, run out of money, run out of energy. And what started off as a relatively well-organized and well-resourced campaign had run into ground effectively. So Easter 1942 is really where Tom's the tragic story begins, and that would end at the end of a hangman's noose. Easter 42. Of course, at that time, the Unionist regime had the Special Powers Act, and from the inception of the state, they had used the Special Powers Act to repress and oppress any opposition to their rule. Not only had they set about constructing effectively a form of religious apartheid in terms of discrimination in employment and housing, etc., but they also probably had one of the most effective pieces of emergency legislation ever created in a modern society. And from the establishment of the Northern State, they had used the Special Powers Act to ban all Republican demonstrations or parades, and indeed many labour trade union demonstrations. The regime was very oppressive and repressive. And while it may be strange to think, but in 1942, Republicans were not allowed to hold Easter parades. You imagine how important an Easter parade is to a Republican. And no matter what type of Republican you are, whether you're a Fianna Fáil Republican or a Fine Gael Republican, Easter's whatever, it's a very important parade. But in 1942, Republicans were banned from gathering and remembering their patriot dead. And what happened was that the IRA had decided to launch a number of what were essentially diversionary operations across Belfast to draw the RUC into certain parts of the city, while in other parts of the city, Easter parades could take place. So, C Company, under the command of Tom Williams, and Tom was only a young lad, were given the responsibility for launching an operation. And really what was planned was that there was a regular RUC patrol would travel through the district, and they were to open fire. A number of RA volunteers were to open fire over the car and over the patrol. It was never meant to be an attack upon the patrol itself, but rather, as I say, a diversion operation. So there was Tom pulled together a group, armed them. There were 8 of them in the group. It was 2 young women, actually. They have often been forgotten about, which is often the case with women in the Republican struggle. Margaret Burns, Madge Burns, later Madge McConville, she'd been a very well-known and famous Republican activist in Belfast over many decades, and another young woman, Margaret Nolan. Pat Simpson, Tom Williams himself, who was the OC, Joe Cal, Jimmy Perry, Dixie Cordner, and John Oliver. They were all 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. Very, very, very young. And so the plan was to carry out this operation, draw the enemy forces into Clonard, and allow Republicans in other parts of the city to gather that Easter. And but of course it didn't go according to plan. It very rarely ever did go according to plan. And I'm just going to tell you a little bit about the operation. So shortly after 3 p.m, an RUC patrol car carrying 4 constables turned into Clonard Street and headed towards the junction of Clonard Gardens and the Cashmere Road. On board were Sergeant Archival Lappin, the driver, Constable George Williamson, Constables Patrick Murphy and David McMahon. All 4 were armed with their service revolvers, and in addition, McMahon carried a pump-action shotgun. As the Ford Fee Late car passed the junction of the Clonard Gardens, Tom and his comrades opened fire over the car. For some reason, either deliberately or accidentally, we cannot now know for sure, one of the bullets fired actually struck the car, smashing the rear window, but missing any of the police occupants. Constable Williamson accelerated into Clonard Gardens, where instead of hastily driving away, which the active service unit expected, Lappin, McMahon and Murphy alighted from the car, drew their weapons, and set off on a run back towards Comport Street and the scene of the shooting. The stage was now set for a confrontation that would have far-reaching tragic consequences. So when the squad opened fire, the expectation was that the RUC would hightail it out of the district very quickly, right? But in fairness to the constables, it didn't. So the plan was that the active service unit would return to a house in Comport Street, which is just a nearby street. And thinking that the RUC had hastily left the district, but they hadn't. So meanwhile, Sergeant Lappin, Constables McMahon and Murphy raced into Comport Street in hot pursuit. And it was Murphy who entered Comport Street entry, little back alleyway, in time to see Pat Simpson and Margaret Burns enter 53 by the back door. He returned to his colleagues in Comport Street and told them that a number of suspects had entered a house somewhere near the bottom of the street. Lappin then directed Murphy to return to the entry and cover the back of the houses, while he and McMahon conducted a door-to-door search of the last few houses. And this is where a very brave but foolhardy Constable Patrick Murphy, instead of standing guard outside the back of the house, decided that he would enter the house. And this is where the confrontation took place between the active service unit. So, with his revolver drawn, Murphy advanced across a small backyard towards the scullery of the house. He was spotted by one of the IRA group who alerted the rest. And in a statement that Tom Williams later made to the RUC hospital, he described what happened next. He says, I ran into the scullery. There's a little glass enclosure in the yard, and from the scullery window I could see a policeman coming into the enclosure with his gun drawn. When he was about 3 yards from me and beside the kitchen window, I pointed my revolver at his body and fired one shot. He staggered and fired back, and I fired 4 or 5 more shots. And Murphy was struck and dropped dead in the scullery of the house in Comport Street. Tom was wounded, and by this time the active service unit had realised that the house was surrounded, and Tom collapsed at the bottom of the stairs in a pool of blood, and his comrades carried him up into the bedroom above. And they knew by this point that there was no escape, that the house was surrounded. And of course, whenever the rest of the RUC constables who were now in the area in great force entered the house and found Constable Patrick Murphy lying dead in a pool of blood, you can imagine they were angry and out for revenge. They discovered the squad upstairs, proceeded to, as you would expect, no doubt, to mercilessly beat them. Whenever the inspector in Springfield Road Barracks arrived at the scene, he found Joe Cal covered in so much blood that he thought he'd been shot in the head. Obviously, the situation was a lot of violence used against the boys. So they were arrested. All 8 were arrested. The 2 women were taken to Armagh prison, and the lads were taken to Crumlin Road. Tom was taken to Royal Victoria Hospital to recuperate from his wounds. They were all then subsequently charged with the murder of Constable Patrick Murphy. And the trial took place on I think it was something like this. It began on the 20th of July in 1942. And of course, it was probably the single biggest political trial to take place in the city in decades, possibly ever, up until that point at least. And for example, the judge was a judge called Edward Sullivan Murphy. There's a lot of Murphys in this, you know? A lot of Murphys, right? And the interesting history about Murphy was that he was from Dublin, and he and his family were, I suppose, part of the Protestant aristocracy. And after partition, they left the new Free State and moved north. So they were Unionist he was a Unionist by conviction, not by coincidence. And but he was an interesting character. It's just, you know, it shows you how sectarian the state was, I suppose, at that time, how different it was compared to these days. So the judge was he was a Unionist. He had been a Unionist MP. He had been a Grand Master of the Orange Lodge, a proud member of the Apprentice Boys, etc., etc. But he was also one of the High Court judges at the time. You know, something that just wouldn't be tolerated even now. The trial lasted for obviously a number of days, and they were found guilty and sentenced to death. The 2 young women, probably maybe a case of reverse discrimination, weren't sentenced to death. They were Madge Burns, Neil McConville, Madge Burns was sentenced to a number of years in prison, and the other young woman was I think released after a short period in prison. So it was the 6 lads who were charged and convicted with murder and sentenced to death. And I suppose a little bit of the story about Tom's story was that then, after their convictions, there was this huge national and international reprieve campaign, a global campaign. It started in the middle of the Second World War, in the middle of the horrendous casualties of that conflict, that this particular event could generate so much interest globally across the world, but it did. It was a huge national and international reprieve campaign was mounted. So, for example, a petition was immediately organised in Ireland and in Britain, particularly Irish, large cities that had an Irish community in it, and it was presented to the Stormont regime on the 21st of August, and it had over 250,000 signatories, gathered in such a relatively short period of time, but over 250,000. It was signed by Catholic cardinals, bishops, priests, TDs, MPs, trade unionists, labour people, a relatively significant number of people from the Presbyterian Protestant community in Belfast, who had no sympathy for the IRA, of course, but did not want to see these young men executed. James Larkin, for example, led a delegation that met De Valera and lobbied the Southern government, De Valera's government, to intervene on behalf of the lads and seek the reprieve. Of course, the irony is that De Valera agreed that he would intervene on their behalf, and yet this was the same De Valera who had George Plant, who was executing Republicans, IRA volunteers in his own jurisdiction. But he, for politically expedient reasons, of course, decided that he must or he should intervene on behalf of the 6 young men and seek their reprieve. That there's a contradiction. But also Irish America, of course, was mobilised. A lot of Irish American political heavyweights pressed Roosevelt. Roosevelt was being aware I mean, it's incredible to think that that in the middle of the Second World War, that this issue was being raised with the President of the US in the middle of the Second World War. So senior Irish American politicians raised it with Roosevelt, and he instructed his Secretary of Defense, or whoever it was, to intervene with Churchill to try and secure the reprieve of the lads. The CPI, the Communist Party of Ireland, were in contact with their comrades in the Soviet Union and with Mr. Stalin, and whatever influence they had was brought to bear, and the Soviets intervened. I'm not saying that Stalin rang Roosevelt and Churchill, but at a fairly senior level, the Soviets did respond and raise the matter. The Vatican also intervened, again, I suppose because of the significant role of the Irish Catholic hierarchy in Ireland and within the wider hierarchy of the Catholic Church at that time would have been quite significant. So the Vatican intervened, and the papal nuncio was sent to lobby the press. So an incredibly broad reprieve campaign was mounted over those 2 months to try and save these young men's lives. And then finally, Tim Mac Uilliam, a wonderful historian, obviously. If I can just find this page. He wrote and explained what he believed, or what he was able to find actually happened that saved the lives of the other lads, the 5 lads. So according to Tim Mac Uilliam anyway, Cardinal McCrory approached Cardinal Hensley, a close personal friend of a guy called Brenton Bracken, who was an Irishman but was a close friend and confidant of Churchill. And he was Churchill's wartime Minister for Information at the time. And it was Bracken who, it's believed, in turn exercised what was probably a decisive influence on Churchill himself, who then intervened with the Stormont, with the regime, the Unionist regime. And as a consequence of his intervention, and this was only for political reasons, this wasn't for any great concern for the IRA or the sympathies of IRA supporters, or the sensitivities of IRA supporters. This was because of the concern that the executions would have on the general population, north and south, at the time. And then on the 30th of August, the Stormont regime issued a statement reprieving all of the 5 except Tom Williams. And they were determined, I suppose, to have their pound of flesh. Why Tom? Well, Tom was the OC of the unit. Right from the start, he accepted responsibility. He made a statement to the fact that he was in charge and that he was alone was responsible for the death of Constable Murphy. And for that reason, he was singled out, and they were determined to execute at least one of the group. And Tom found out they were all called down to the legal cells underground in Crumlin Road Prison. Demeter's solicitor, her sister was D.P. Marrinan. And he looked at them all in turn and finally turned to Tom and he said, "I've good news for everyone except Tom." And he told them all, but Tom, that they had been reprieved. There was a stunned silence for a few moments, and then Tom was the first to speak, and he said, "Don't grieve for me." He says, "Remember, lads, from day one, this is how I wanted it. I wanted to die, was willing to die, and I'm happy that you 5 are going to live." And you can imagine a small group of young men, some of them burst into tears, some of them were distraught. Some of them, Joe recalled that they initially were refused. They refused to leave the legal rooms, the legal cells. They wouldn't leave Tom, but they were persuaded to leave, and they were separated. They were taken back to their cells, separated, and that was the last time they would see Tom. And there was a last minute, over the course of a couple of days, there was a huge last minute effort to try and secure the reprieve of Tom. And of course it was unsuccessful, despite the intervention of a lot of very influential political, religious and military leaders, for example. The Unionist government couldn't be persuaded to reprieve Tom. So I'm just going to go to the execution here and just read a little bit out of the detail. And at the time, whenever I was researching this, if anyone has visited the Crum, they would know this, but in Crumlin Road Prison, anyone condemned to be hung, you were kept in a particular cell in C Wing, at the end of C Wing, one of the prison blocks. And what the individual would not have known was that there was a large cupboard alongside one of the walls of the cell. It's a large, like almost double cell, larger than most cells. And it was, the door to the gallows was behind that cupboard. And the person to be executed would have spent his days and last weeks in that cell, not knowing that behind the cupboard was the door to the execution cell. And it was only at the last minute that was moved to the side, and the prisoner, or prisoners, but the prisoner was taken literally from his cell into the next room and executed. So they wouldn't have known that. It wouldn't have been widely known to the individual, because they were kept in isolation, you see, and they were under 24-hour guard. There was a prison officer in the cell with Tom, with the others before they were reprieved, but in the last days with Tom 24/7 to prevent them taking their own lives. So anyway, 2nd of September, Tom rose early that morning, dressed, washed and shaved. At around 6:30 a.m, he celebrated Mass with Father Alexis and Father Oliver, and again at 7:15 with Fathers McAllister and McInerney. Fasting that morning, Tom had declined breakfast and the offer of a last cigarette he liked to smoke that morning. saying that he wanted the body and blood of our Lord Jesus to be the last thing he had taken before he died. He was quite a religious young man, as many people were at that time in that period. And just minutes before 8 a.m., he was anointed by one of the priests. Shortly before the stroke of 8, the cell door opened and the two executioners entered, accompanied by the prison governor and a number of prison and city officials. The main executioner was an Englishman, Thomas Pierpoint, the infamous hangman, and he was assisted by his nephew Albert Pierpoint, who had been brought, both of them had been brought in from England by boat some days before. Albert Pierpoint went on to become England's chief executioner, executing dozens of men and women during the course of his what became a notorious career. So with 2 or 3 determined strides, they were beside Tom, usually seated with his back to the entrance of the cell. The condemned man was asked to stand by the chief executioner, Thomas Pierpoint. Then they bound Tom's arms behind his back with a leather buckled strap. And it was said by colleagues of the Pierpoints that Thomas Pierpoint often sucked the boiled sweet as he calmly readied the prisoners for the drop. Both men were practiced and efficient executioners. And as the buckle of the leather strap was fastened, the 2 prison guards present moved to either side of the large wooden locker which stood against one of the walls. The locker was lifted clear to reveal the door to the gallows. And it was standard practice to locate the gallows and condemned cell side by side. In order not to distress the condemned man, the adjoining door was kept concealed until the last moment. The chief executioner stepped towards the door, opened it, and just a few short paces away lay the gallows trap. He led Tom through the door, while the other executioner walked behind him should he need assistance. He didn't. Without a falter in his step, he calmly walked the last few paces of his life. And as he did so, the rest of the group positioned themselves around the gallows. Tom was halted when he reached a white T painted in the centre of the wooden floor. And for a few seconds, he stood facing the noose dangling inches from his face. He remained calm. As the chief executioner pulled a white linen hood from his pocket, Father Alexis stepped forward and pressed a small crucifix to Tom's lips. As the hood was pulled down over his face, he spoke aloud, "Sacred Heart of Jesus, be my salvation." The noose was placed tightly around his neck, while the assistant executioner strapped his legs together and stepped clear. For a moment, Tom stood there alone before the trapdoors collapsed and a small body dropped from sight. The trapdoors slamming below would have and did send a boom out across the prison, saving the onlookers from the sound of his neck breaking as a rope snapped taut. After a few minutes, the assistant executioner and a doctor descended through a small door in the floor into the room below where Tom's body was now hanging. The body was checked for signs of life and left to hang alone in the room for 1 hour, as per prison policy. Out on the Crumlin Road, a notice of execution was pinned to the prison gates. An hour after the execution, Tom's 5 comrades were led from their cells to the prison chapel, and the jail was silent. So too was the chapel, except for the sobs of a small group of prisoners. One of the priests began to say mass, but broke down weeping and was unable to carry on. Another priest stood up and continued with the mass. And when the mass was finished, all present gathered in the sacristy, and it was Father Alexis who spoke, and he said, "I met the bravest of the brave this morning." Tom Williams walked to the scaffold without a tremor in his body. And Tom's body was then placed in a plain wooden coffin, was marched from C wing across to the back of between A wing and D wing, and it said that as the coffin was carried by prison officers and some ordinary prisoners, quite a number of prison officers saluted the coffin as a mark of respect as the coffin passed by. So, and he was buried in an unmarked grave. It was prison policy at that time, as was the case throughout Ireland, during the War of Independence, for example, when any of the IRA volunteers who were executed in Dublin in particular, but in a few cases outside Dublin, were buried in unmarked graves. And if you remember, it wasn't until the early 2000s that Kevin Barry and all the rest were finally exhumed and laid to rest. And I was one of the many thousands of mourners who watched those remains being returned to their families. So Tom was buried in an unmarked grave, and in 1942, and it wasn't until 1999 the Belfast National Graves Association, for decades, which included Joe Cal and some of Tom's closest friends and comrades from that period in the IRA, had campaigned for decades to have his remains identified and exhumed. And of course, the British government had always made excuses and refused to exhume the remains, and it was any excuse to prevent it. And I fancy when the peace process really had begun and things had begun to change a little bit, the regime had moved to a position of more liberal attitude as opposed to issues to do with prisoners. And also the Belfast National Graves had managed to track down a distant relative of Tom who was living in Canada, and they persuaded him to lobby the British Secretary of State, the British colonial governor in Ireland, to have Tom's remains exhumed. So that combination of the finding the relative, and they brought in experts, and they found his remains. And I was in prison at the time. I was in Long-Cais, East Blocks. I wrote my book in prison, and I'd been released by the British government to launch my book. The book was launched. It was during the peace process. I launched the book in the films. I was released on parole, and we launched the book in the films. Joe Cal was there, Tomás Mac Uilliam, two of the surviving members of the squad at the time. And but he was a fantasy. His remains were exhumed. I was in prison, but over 50,000 people gathered and followed Tom's remains as they moved along the Falls Road to his resting place in Milltown Cemetery. So a young boy who was executed by the British in 1942, his remains were only finally exhumed in 1989, and 50,000 people from all over the country travelled to Belfast to pay their respects to young Tom Williams, and he's buried beside his mother in Milltown Cemetery. So that's the story of Tom Williams. Tom is Belfast Kevin Barry, and any young nationalist or Republican growing up in Belfast and beyond Belfast would have grown up listening, just as you Dubs would have grown up singing Kevin Barry, and we grew up singing, brave Tom Williams, we salute you, and it was part of our upbringing. So it was a hugely significant event when his remains were finally exhumed and reinterred beside his family, and towards the end of 1989. So, Sinead.
It was a very moving talk that you gave, though, especially in terms of his death. A lot of people are saying that with the comments. I just wanted to ask about Kevin Barry, because there are similarities even with the story, never mind the song, with Kevin Barry, in terms of like him being, in an unmarked grave for years, in terms of like, shooting somebody that's a soldier. Do you want to explain maybe a little bit more why people saw the Kevin Barry link? Was it just the music, or was there other reasons?
No. Similar age, obviously executed by the British. Both of them hung by the British. So you can see the very obvious similarity. I thought I'm never ever surprised by the hypocrisy of members of the Southern establishment historically. you know, from early Fine Gael through to De Valera and Fianna Fáil. How De Valera could see fit to intervene to try and save the life of 6 young IRA volunteers, but at the same time was executing the very same. The very same. George Plant was executed following a military court earlier in 1942. And George Plant would have been someone that De Valera would have known personally. He was a seasoned volunteer, as opposed to someone like Tom, who was a young man, a very young man. So it was just just two similarities. And of course, at that time, thousands of people gathered on the streets, tens of thousands actually, in Belfast, in places like Newry and Dublin, and it's very well recorded. Workers walked out of factories, dockers walked out of the docks as a mark of respect in places like Sligo and Dublin and Newry. It was a hugely important event, despite the fact it was in the middle of the Second World War and the slaughter and the trauma of all that. It had a huge impact on nationalist Ireland. Many unionists, I suppose, welcomed the execution. You know, probably many ordinary loyalists and unionists in Belfast who had family fighting in the British Army and the British forces felt that they had been stabbed in the back by the IRA and wanted to welcome the execution. So once again, it was an event that deeply divided the city at that time.
David Rees has asked, Tom Williams was a lieutenant in C Company. Could you explain anything about the command structure of the IRA at that time?
Yeah, the IRA in some respects was not dissimilar in its hierarchy and its structure to the British Army or most contemporary armies at the time. So at Belfast, at that point, was a Belfast Battalion. And of course, in an army, you have companies, you have battalions, and you have brigades, and each of them have a layer upon one another. So in Belfast, you would have had a number of companies. C Company historically, I'm from Clonard. I'm from Tom Williams. That's why I wrote about Tom. That's why I was drawn to him. I'm from the same area that Tom grew up and came from. So the area of Clonard was C Company. You would sort of need to know the geography of the city a little bit, but Belfast is made up of a patchwork of communities, small communities, and like any big city, I suppose, worker class city. So Clonard had its own distinct culture and identity and sense of itself. If you came from Clonard, you came from Clonard. You didn't come from Beatsmount, or you didn't come from the Loney, or you didn't come from Andytown. You come from Tala, you come from Tala and Dublin. You don't come from the leafy suburbs of Dublin 4. So Belfast was very similar. The IRA was made up of companies, but those companies corresponded to little communities. So C Company corresponded to Clonard, right? It was a historical connection. D Company was, if you like, the bottom end of the falls from the edge of the city centre up to the Royal Victoria Hospital, right? That was D Company, right? And so on out to the west. And you had the Short Strand, the markets are down in the north. So almost all of those little communities corresponded to a company so it was A, B, C Company, D or E, but Clonard was C Company. Very famous because of the connections between Joe Cahill and Tom Williams and people like that. And even to this day, even when the IRA in the 70s moved from like a company structure to a more secret cell structure. Those areas still retained the names of C Company, D Company, even though effectively they no longer existed. They still represented something significant to the people in those areas and the people in the area in those areas. So, so it was a traditional company, battalion, brigade. But the Belfast didn't become a brigade again until, I think, 1970, with the re-emergence of the modern conflict. Up until then, it had been a battalion since Joe McVeigh and its heyday in the early 1920s, when it may have had 1,000 or 1,500 volunteers, and justified a brigade, a larger brigade structure. Really, between partition and the Civil War, the RA functioned at a battalion and company level, lower level, just because of the numbers. Didn't have the numbers to justify a brigade. And it wasn't until 1970 that the RA, again, at a heyday, may have had anywhere between 1,000 and 2,000 members in 1970, 1971, and became a brigade again with a number of battalions. So that's the structure. And you had OCs. You had an OC was an officer commanding, not the same as the British CO.
Okay.
We just turned it around. Rather than copy the British Army totally, just turned it around. OC. But Brian, yes, historically OCs as opposed to COs. Okay. But they would have had a staff. They would have had an OC. You would have had an adjutant. You would have had an intelligence officer. You would have had a quartermaster. You would have had a recruiting officer. Depending upon of course, the strength at any given time, imprisonment, people going on the run, internment, death, had an impact on that. So the extent to which those structures functioned and functioned fully obviously changed considerably over time as people were arrested or killed there.
You know, when you were mentioning about the petition and the amount of numbers that it had, like Brian McGee was asking, is the petition in any archive?
I honestly don't know. When I was writing the book, I was in Longcash, and one of the teachers, I was studying, like many Republican prisoners at the time, we were heavily involved with the Open University.
Yeah.
A lot of people were studying for their degrees, for master's degrees, and indeed PhDs as well. And I was studying for a history degree, and I had chosen the subject, and I looked at it from a media perspective. No, how the media in 1942. I took the Irish News and I took the newsletter. Okay. And I took the same events. You know, and interpreted how they reported the same events at exactly the same time, but in completely two different ways. Yeah. And I looked at the language, right? But that's where the book emerged from. But there was a number of teachers in the Open University. I'll not name them, because you know, we did appreciate the support they gave us. But they actually went to the public record office for me and did some research for me to help. And in the little book, there's I did get, for example, one of the things we did discover, that there's still a closed file that is still a secret file. Still now releasing to Tom Williams, that they will not open. They are refusing to open. I don't know why, what the reason of that may be. But at the time, the reason why I found out was because I managed to get some photographs. The way, obviously, if you're arrested, you're sent to prison. When you enter the prison, your clothes are taken off you. You're photographed, for example, for the record. So I managed to get the photographs of all the lads, including a very young Joe Cal, whenever he went in. Yeah. You know, you might not be able to see this because it's quite. That's Joe Cal here. Right. That's his mugshot.
Yes. Did you have a photo of Tom?
That's when he went in. They wouldn't let me have the one of Tom, right? That's when Joe went in. So Joe was maybe 19 or 20, and that's him getting out. Wow. You see, he's considerably less hair in that one. Wow. And he was closer to the familiar Joe Cal by then, with the baldy head and the pipe, right? But they wouldn't. There was an extensive file that the British government, the Secretary of State, because we wrote, I got my solicitor to write to the Secretary of State at the time. Couldn't remember who they were, and they refused to open the file. So there's still a lot of closed files. Who knows why? And I suspect perhaps the petition could well be there. There could be any number of reasons. It could be, why that would be the case.
It's interesting.
So maybe we should get. Maybe I should get my solicitor to write to the new Secretary of State and say, because I would love to get a photograph of Tom. You know, there is no. That's an image of Tom, wherever you can see it. Just right. It's taken from a very, very old photograph when he was a kid. It's not a very good photograph. It would be wonderful to get a photograph of him that was taken while he was in prison.
Yeah.
Before he was executed. But so maybe I get good thinking, whoever raised that question about the petition. I'm going to try and get that photograph of Tom Williams, because I always remember whenever, if anybody's ever seen has anyone ever seen the police photographs of the hunger strikers who died in 1981? When you see the photographs of the hunger strikers that were used in the posters during the protest and the hunger strike, right? And then you see the photographs of the guys taken in either the police barracks or in prison, and they're so different. You can't really, it's not until you see those photographs that you see the real people. And I suspect the same with Tom Williams. When you see, when you it's like the popular image of Bobby Sands. When you see the real image of Bobby Sands, he's so different than the mural of Bobby Sands.
That's right. There are photos that came out there recently.
So different. So different. And I suspect with Tom that if we were to get the photograph of him, he would look so different. And even Kevin Barry, wouldn't it be great to have a better photograph of Kevin Barry? Although his photograph is better than Tom. But I'm going to do that. I'm going to try and get that photograph.
I hope you do.
I'm going to get my solicitor to write to the British Colonial Secretary of State and ask them to open the file. Okay?
You should. And let us know how you get on. Because the next person in the comments has said that they have a memory card of Tom that was passed down from their granny, who was a good friend of Tom, believe it or not. But their name is Galaxy S7 Edge on this, and I think they're gone now. But if you want to get in contact with Jim, you can do so through Facebook. Let's see. A question I have for you is, if this was being raised in the US and Soviet Russia and the church, apart from De Valera, what was the reaction in the 26 counties? Because you would have had Republicans who fought in the War of Independence and the Civil War. Like, how were they seeing it?
It became a huge cause célèbre, I think, for a very broad section of Republican and nationalist opinion, which is why De Valera was probably forced, as a consequence of that public opinion in the state, to take the position that he did. Like, why would De Valera care? He was executing Tom Williams' comrades at exactly the same moment in time. So I think that says a lot, that public opinion, and it's an interesting thing about the psyche of the, I suppose, the nationalist, of course, not the unionist section of our community, but the nationalist section of the people of Ireland, that notwithstanding people's reservations about the IRA, violence, even when people were implacably opposed to armed struggle or violence, there has always been this deep-seated, I suppose, respect for prisoners. O'Donovan Rossa. O'Donovan Rossa was the terrorist and the bomber of his time. O'Donovan Rossa was a Fenian bomber. Michael Davitt was a Fenian bomber. The first bombing campaign was carried out by O'Donovan Rossa and Michael Davitt and Tom Clark. So, but of course, when those people were imprisoned or executed or when O'Donovan Rossa came back home from the States, you know, his wake, tens and tens of thousands of nationalists paid their respects to O'Donovan Rossa. So there's something in the Irish psyche, I think, about prisoners, about Republic, and which is very different than support for the IRA or violence in any phase or in any part of the struggle. People just have this, I think, a respect, and it's connected through history from ancient times, right through the tradition of Bombay Street, right through to Terence McSweeney and so on, right through to Bobby Sands. So, you know, I think there's something deep in their own historical psyche that's why. And yes, I think the majority of nationalist opinion, for humanitarian reasons as much as anything else, were very passionately involved in trying to secure the reprieve of all those 6, because they were all under 21. Okay. Young boys all.
Liam has said that was an excellent lecture. He's not going to give you a load of questions as he found this tough to listen to. It was very emotional. Rest in peace, Tom, and well done, Jim McVeigh. Brian McGee, although I know the story and family were friends with Tom, this was a very poignant talk. Gormaiga Jim. Sue Lavery, very moving. May he rest in peace. Great lecture. Thank you, says another person. Excellent talk. Heartbreaking. Patrick Duffy is asking you, how did you manage to write a book in prison? Were you let out to visit archives or libraries this afternoon?
No, I got down in the tunnel, went out under the fence, and then returned. No,
back for tea time.
Remember, it was the early stage of the peace process. You know, 1994, the first IRA cessation negotiations had begun. The regime within the prison was becoming increasingly more liberal, with more freedom. But Republicans at that time in the H blocks and our female comrades in Armagh and subsequently McGabry prison, where the women were held, we had always, I suppose, participated in the education that was available, particularly the Open University. Dozens and dozens of Republican prisoners studied with the Open University, achieved degrees, honours degrees, masters, PhDs, and I was one of those people. So we were able to, in my case, as I say, I looked at how the newsletter and the Irish News reported those events at the time, and in fairness to the teachers, some of the teachers went and photocopied that material for us. We wrote to the Public Record Office, we wrote to the libraries, and 9 times out of 10, the people who worked in those institutions were very, very helpful and were very keen to help us, and would have went the extra mile in terms of doing a little bit of the work, the physical work. But you might find it funny, but I remember in 1990, say it was 1995, or so, I can't remember the exact year, as part of this liberalisation process, the prison authorities installed a phone box at the top of each wing.
Okay.
Right? Not one of those red phone boxes, right? But a little phone box nonetheless. And you could actually buy, like, they were almost like credit card size tokens.
Yeah.
Right? And you could insert it into the phone, and like you got so many minutes for so much money, right? And I actually conducted an interview with Joe Cal on the phone.
Right.
Yeah. And a number of other people. So there was little things like that were interesting. I was able to do interviews on the phone on occasion with some of the key people. Joe was still alive. Madge McConfield, Burns' tour maiden name, was still alive. Others wrote into me. Some wonderful memoirs from that period. Written letters from different people, including Joe, for example, in my at home. So that's how it was done. It took a couple of years, and of course I realised when I was doing it, like Joe McKelvey, why has no one wrote a book about this? Because it's a fascinating little glimpse into our history at the time, and I wrote the book, and it was published by Beyond the Pale Publications at the time, and I was proud of sponsor. I got out on I think it might have been a Thursday, beautiful, glorious summer's day. I was released on parole, picked up outside the prison gates, taken to the Fallons in West Belfast, and we had the book launch in the Fallons Club. Right?
All right.
And there was about 300 or 400 people packed into the room to launch a book. And Joe Cahill was there, Madge McConville, and a lot of Tom's old friends that helped launch the book. So it was wonderful, wonderful event. Personal highlight of my life was the book launch. You know, young working class boy from Clonard, you know, getting to write a book and publish a book and launch it to such a reception was fantastic.
Well deserved as well. Mary Ellen, excellent, Jim.
Mary Ellen.
Corey McDonald, excellent talk. It was very interesting for us. Well done. John Donnelly, well done, Jim. Mary Ellen has said that Tom's mother's family was burnt out of Weaver Street in the 1920s.
Well, Weaver Street is infamous because of it was the scene of probably the worst single attack by loyalists during the pogrom in the 1920s, where a bomb was lobbed into the street and half a dozen children were playing in the street were killed. It was probably the single most infamous attack of the pogroms during that period was the bomb attack in Weaver Street. And he could have, I don't know what street he's from, but yeah, they were from that part. A little small Catholic enclave on the Shore Road, a little like I suppose a short strand of the markets that was the focus of ferocious, horrendous sectarian attacks during that period.
Okay. Matthew Lynn, Skills Starul, Gahintuk. Paddy Campbell, thanks Jim for another very interesting talk. Was hanging the go-to method of execution for the British to do to IRA men charged with killing police and soldiers? Like, apart from Tom and Kevin, were there other volunteers hanged by the British at that time?
Yes, not in Belfast. Tom was the last IRA volunteer to be officially executed by the British, which is another reason why he's significant. But interestingly, on the day that Tom, during the Reprieve campaign, the IRA effectively suspended its military campaign to allow the public focus to be upon the Reprieve campaign and the calls for the young men to be sent to prison rather than executed. On the day that Tom was hung, a flying column of the IRA crossed the border into South Armagh on an open back lorry, heavily armed. They were planning to attack the RUC barracks in Crossmaglen.
Oh, yeah.
And it was their intention. It was their intention to, if possible, capture a British officer, and it was their intention to hang him.
Really?
In retaliation for the hanging of. Unfortunately, the flying column ran into an RUC patrol, and it was an exchange of fire. The authorities were alerted to the fact that there was an IRA group in South Armagh, and they had to hightail it back across the border. But interestingly, like, do you remember was it the Argoon in Palestine that hung a number of British soldiers? Do you remember that?
Yeah, no, I don't know that.
Okay. During the emergency years in Palestine, whenever the British occupied Palestine before the State of Israel was created, the Argoon, the Israeli terrorists, right?
Okay.
Jewish terrorists, a number of their men were captured by the British and hung by the British. So they retaliated. They kidnapped a number of British soldiers and hung them in the streets of Jerusalem.
Right.
And the IRA tried to do the same on the morning of the 2nd of September 1942, but were thwarted by the RUC.
Yeah, it could have really went the other way very easily. Yeah. Carla Miller, excellent talk. Thanks for sharing and hosting. Deirdre Colligan, brilliant talk. David Rees, thanks to all involved for organising, and especially to Jim McVeigh for telling the story of brave Tom Williams. From Liam, interesting, very moving. Well done, Jim. David Rees, last question. Why is Tom not buried in the Republican plot? Was his wish to be with family, or?
It was the family, the family's wish. And remember, by this time, it was a great not a great uncle, but a relative fairly far removed from the immediate family. And I think it was his wish and the wish of the other remaining family members that he be buried beside his mother. So while, yes, it was Tom's wish in his last letters was to be buried alongside his comrades, the family decided that he should be buried beside his mother. I think his mother had died of one of those working class diseases that is a very young woman, and they were left in the care of their father. So yes, he's buried beside his mother. Sure, what's wrong with that, you know?
Yeah. Mary Ellen has said
okay.
The Weaver Street attack was the second in just over a year. The previous one was in Milewater Street. Both targeted children. Let's see. Damien Johnson, interesting lecture on Brave Tom Williams tonight. Well done to Jim telling Tom's story. Very moving. Deirdre Colgan, heartbreaking. Carla Miller, I first heard a Tom Williams song in Swim to Birds pub in Sydney, Australia. A song by my elderly uncle. I also had the great pleasure in meeting Joe Cahill. Great story, fair play, both of you. Nearly done. David Rees had the privilege of being one of the many to be bearer of the coffin of Joe Cahill at his funeral. I know he was proud of Tom throughout his life. And from PJ, the National Graves Association held a play in Crumlin Road Gaol on the anniversary of the 2nd of September route by Rosaline Welch.
Yeah. I just want to finish, Marcus, by saying there's an organisation that's still in existence called the Belfast National Graves Association.
Oh, is there?
Not the same as the National Graves Association that are responsible, for example, for the Sean Russell Monument and many others. But over the years, I just want to pay tribute to the many people who do that type of work.
Yeah.
You know, who look after monuments and graves and erect new monuments and graves. And I remember, I'll just tell you just very quickly, a guy from the ANC coming over from South Africa to Ireland to learn from the Republican movement. The ANC were planning at the time to build a huge monument, I think, in Johannesburg to their fallen comrades, to the soldiers of MK who fought the guerrilla war in their struggle. And they were blown away by the way in which history is very much commemorated in Ireland. Like, you go any town or any village, you turn a corner, you turn a country road, you'll see a monument.
Yeah.
You know, you'll see a small spot marked. And of course, in Belfast now, you've got a proliferation of more gardens that have been by. So Clonard has one. There's a little bit of competition and good competition in any community. So Clonard has one. The Falls has got one. Beachmount has got one. These might mean very much to you if you don't know Belfast. Andersonstown have a number of them. Trumbrook's got one. Ballymurphy has one. It's incredible the work that hundreds of people put into remembering those people who sacrificed so much for others. So I want to commend the people in the National Graves and commemoration committees all over the country who do fantastic work looking after, restoring, and indeed creating new monuments. You know, there's a book, Marcus. There's a book. There's a good book for you. The monuments, the Republican Monuments of Ireland. It's never been done.
That's our talk tomorrow. Republican Monuments of Shield Lansing tomorrow. What was I going to say to you, Jim?
Bestseller. That would be a bestseller.
It would actually. I'll get on to Shane and see if he's going to do it or not. All right. I have to say though, Jim, like, you're keeping the untold stories alive, or the less well-known stories alive, and it's a credit to you. I mean, and you're doing in the same way what the people who are putting up monuments these people are doing. You're keeping the story alive, and the way you told that story tonight, everyone's saying it in the comments how heartbreaking and moving it was. Fair play to you, Jim, and I'm certainly going to meet up with you after this lockout or after this lockdown. All right, take care.
No problem. Thanks for tuning in, folks. Thank you. My pleasure.
All the best. Take care.
Okay,
Bye.
Baby.
Anything else?